Good evening. Thank you guys for coming out tonight. My name is Jamie Hazlett, and I'm the outreach librarian here at the Hannon Library. And I need to extend a special thank you to our co-sponsors for the evening, the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and the LMU Department of Ethnic and Intercultural Services and Chicano Latino Student Services. We're feeling particularly lucky to have tonight's guest here during Latino Heritage Month and during Banned Book Week. This is a time where we are reminded about how fortunate we all are collectively to be here together in an environment where the encouragement of learning in all forms, even the exploration of provocative and non-mainstream ideas, is an integral part of an LMU education. Tonight's speaker is a Los Angeles native who is the son of Guatemalan immigrants. Héctor Tobar has a storied career as a journalist with the Los Angeles Times, where he served as the paper's bureau chief in Mexico City and Buenos Aires. In 1992, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his work covering the Los Angeles riots. And last year, he won a special place in my heart for his work covering the shameful interrogation of LAUSD librarians, one of whom is sitting right behind you. And by school district attorneys who will never understand the value that librarians and their work can bring to a community. He has written 3 novels, including The Tattooed Soldier, which was published in 1998, Translation Nation, published in 2005, and most recently, The Barbarian Nurseries, which was published to critical acclaim in 2011. It was on the best books of 2011 lists of the LA Times, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Boston Globe, and most recently was just awarded the California Book Award Gold Medal for Fiction, an honor which places him alongside a few other California authors you may have heard of, including Michael Chabon, T.C. Boyle, and John Steinbeck. So we're thrilled that he's here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming Héctor Tobar.
Well, thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful afternoon, and thank you to Lola Marymount for inviting me. Thank you to the library. It's an honor to be here, especially in this brand new facility. It's just a privilege, really, to speak about one's work when one is a writer. Does anybody here have any sort of aspirations or has already been published or wants to be a writer? Anybody here think about life and writing? You know, I ask because writing is a really solitary thing, and my third book is really the product of a big failure in my writing career. I tried to write, and everyone who has ever been, I think, successful in writing, really successful, has one really big failure. And mine was the first draft of this book, The Barbarian Nurseries. The first draft was called Farewell, California, and it was my second novel. And I started it back in the mid-1990s. And it was my response to the whole anti-immigrant movement, which was starting then in the mid-1990s when I was still in graduate school trying to get my MFA and finishing my first novel. And so I started a second novel, and I finished it on the day that my wife went into labor with our first son. I finished it that morning, and then in the evening, my son was born. And I spent another year working on the next draft of it, and then I sent it to my agent. And and every writer has a story like this. So I sent it to my agent, except this was a little bit more extreme. And I sent it to my agent, and she sent it out, and it was rejected by every publisher in New York City, all the publishers in Minneapolis, in North Carolina, in San Francisco, and I thought my career in writing fiction was over. So I wrote another book, nonfiction, called Translation Nation, my second book, and then I went on tour for that, and I met a lot of people who read my first book thanks to universities. A lot of universities assigned my first novel, The Tattooed Soldier, and I met a lot of readers for that novel who asked me, well, when's the next one coming? And I went back to this novel I had written before several years later, looking at it with fresh eyes, and I realized it was a really terrible book. And it was just too angry. I learned that there's a difference. My work tries to make a point about the world, about the city that I live in, but I've learned really, especially as I get older, the value of art and studying one's craft. And all of you are here to begin. Many of you are here to begin that. Many of you are far along. Many of you watch other people study their crafts. And, it's a lifestyle. It's a whole lifelong commitment to something. And I have now a lifelong commitment to writing. And so I restarted this novel in 2005. And by then I had 3 kids. And this is a novel about a family. And I had written that first draft before my first son was born. So now I was writing about a family when I had 3 kids. It's sort of like, it's like getting a PhD in life, in just observing life and observing how family is put together. And so I started in 2005. Worked on it in my kitchen, usually. My kids would get on the bus to go to school, and I would sit at the dining room table before everybody woke up. I'm a morning person. People are either morning writers or evening writers. I never heard of anybody who's like a middle of the day writer. But I don't know why that is. But I'm a morning writer, and I would get up and I would work on this. And then my kids would wake up, and I would make them cream of wheat. Or sometimes when we lived in Mexico City then, and we had live-in help. And the live-in help, our helper would come down, Modesta, who we later fired. He was kind of a little bit of a model of Araceli in the book. Or Benita, who was wonderful. And we'd make the kids breakfast, and then they'd go and wait for the bus. And I had this wonderful experience of I'd write for like an hour in the total quiet. And then I'd go and wait for the bus with my kids, and we'd have usually, it's Mexico City, traffic is unpredictable, so we'd have anywhere from 15 to 20 or 30 minutes before the bus came. We didn't know. And so I would read to my kids from the Lemony Snicket books, the series of unfortunate events, and I would read out loud to my kids, and it's still one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, is reading to them and having them laugh at certain passages and just seeing, the way they responded to this book. And so I was writing a book, and I was watching my kids become readers, and I worked on it for many years. I spent 1 year just working on the first 100 pages, and then I just really had to teach myself what art was and what fiction was. And I remember thinking, God, I had such a really poor education. I was educated in LA public schools. I got a good education in terms of what they wanted me to be. I was supposed to be a scientist. I was a pre-med major. But I didn't really get literature. A good liberal arts education is so valuable in so many ways. It makes you this sort of complete, rounded person. And I didn't really start getting mine until I was in my 30s and 40s. I remember I was in my 40s, and I thought, I've never really read Shakespeare, and so I started reading Shakespeare, as I got one of those CD, lessons, the lectures that you get, and so I learned, what I really learned about this first part of this novel is about this family that's losing things, it's losing its gardener, it's losing the money it had. And so I thought, I read Chekhov, Anton Chekhov. Because Chekhov wrote in the early part of the 20th century about these Russian families that were becoming déclassés. They were losing, their status, especially in this really famous play that I had seen a couple of times called The Cherry Orchard, which I highly recommend to read, and if you ever see a production of it. And so I studied, and I read a lot, and I took my time, and I was very patient. I thought, this is my last chance to write a book. I'm in my 40s now, and after this, my career, it's going to be harder when you get older. And so I really took my time with it. And 5 years, I worked on it, I finished it, I sent it to my agent, and another typical story, my agent didn't reply to me for 5 or 6 months, which is very typical. New York publishing works really slow. Maybe it wasn't 5 or 6 months. Maybe it felt like 5 or 6 months. It was really more like maybe 3 months or so. And then he said, hey, Hector, I'm in LA, and I want to talk to you about your book, and let's go to the Laker game. I thought, oh my God, my agent's inviting me to the Laker game. This is so cool. Hey, my agent's inviting me to the Laker game. So we see the whole game, and finally at the end we're leaving, and I said, well, Jay, what did you think about my book? And he said, well, I had a feeling that was really rare in my career as an agent. I felt like it was a masterpiece. And, after 5 years of not even showing it to anybody, not even my wife, who sort of was mad at me that I was writing a book, because I sort of become another person when I'm writing a novel. I sort of daydream and I live with it, and I just became sort of a zombie. Like a couple of hours every day, I'll be washing the dishes, and I'll suddenly run off and write something down. And so my novel was sold to this great publishing house, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which is fantastic. And now it's taken me all over the world. My previous stop in my, book tour I was in West Hollywood over the weekend, but before that, I was in Munich, Germany, and I heard an actress read my novel translated into German, which was really cool. And before that, I was in Paris. My novel's been translated into French, and it's just really, because you start off with no expectations. I think that when you write a novel, you have a little voice in your head that tells you, this is a really diluted idea to have, because I had the previous experience of writing a novel, and it doesn't really sort of pay, it doesn't, it's something that, it's this intellectual, artistic, fun word exercise. And there's not really any guarantee that this sort of world you have in your head is going to interest anybody else. This sort of I think is true in a lot of things in life. You have an idea for a business, or you have an idea for a play, or you have an idea for some sort of gathering or an event, and you work really hard on it. You have a vision for it, and you don't really know if it's going to work out. And so in my life, this was next to my family and my kids, this was my big project. And it has worked out, and people have sort of related to it. And I like telling those stories because I think it's important that you all know, that one of the great things about coming to a university, one of the great things about hearing people talk about art is demystifying it, It really is, my wife told me the other day, oh, you're just so, it's easy for you because you're so talented. And I said, well, no, everything that I write in 4 or 5 drafts still, I still, really work hard, the prose. So that's how I arrived finally at writing my 3rd book. And the idea behind this novel, it's really 3 books. It's about this family that is having hard times, and they had to fire their Mexican gardener. And it's the beginning of a whole process in which they're shedding themselves of their help in the family, gradually. And so that was the idea that I originally had in the first version of the novel I wrote almost 18 years ago I started writing. It began with the first sentence that's still the first sentence of the novel. I changed the names a little bit, and I'll just read a little bit of this to you. This is from the very beginning of my novel. Scott Torres was upset because the lawnmower wouldn't start, because no matter how hard he pulled at the cord, it didn't begin to roar. His exertions produced only a brief flutter of the engine, like the cough of a sick child, and then an extended silence filled by the buzzing of 2 dragonflies doing figure 8s over the uncut St. Augustine grass. The lawn was precocious, ambitious, 8 inches tall, and for the moment it could entertain jungle dreams of one day shading the house from the sun. The blades would rise as long as he pulled at the cord and the lawnmower coughed. He gripped the cord's plastic handle, paused, and leaned forward to gather breath and momentum and try it again. The lawnmower roared for an instant, spit a clump of grass from its jutting black mouth, and stopped. Scott stepped back from the machine and gave it the angry, everyman stare of fatherliness frustrated, of a handyman being unhandy. Araceli, his Mexican maid, watched him from the kitchen window, her hands covered with a white bubble skin of dishwater. She wondered if she should tell El Señor Scott the secret that made the lawnmower roar. When you turned a knob on the side of the engine, it made starting the machine as easy as pulling a loose thread from a sweater. She had seen Pepe, the gardener, play with this knob several times, but no, she decided to let El Señor Scott figure it out himself. Scott Torres had let Pepe and his chunky gardener's muscles go, and she would allow this struggle with the machine to be her boss's punishment. So that's Scott and Araceli is my protagonist in this novel, and we'll be meeting a lot of her if you read my book. And she's basically my alter ego. She is, she's an intellectual in the body of a servant, or someone who looks like a servant. And it's some, the reason I say that about myself is that I sort of never really felt like I could call myself an author or a writer, even though I've been, that's the only thing I've done for a living for 25 years now. I know it sounds silly, but it's like, there's a whole idea of what writing a book is, and I sort of felt like always like I didn't really know what I was doing until I started, finishing this book. So I gave Araceli that sense. And also, I think if you're a certain kind of person, if you're a Latino in certain situations, if you're a black person in certain situations, if you're a woman in certain situations, if you're gay in certain situations, you know what it's like to have people sort of see you not for who you are, but what you are, right? And so that is what I gave to Araceli. Araceli, they don't see her for who she is. She's an intellectual. She studied for 1 year at the National School of Fine Arts, a public school, a real place in Mexico City. But she couldn't finish her education because her family pressured her to go back to work, which happens to so many women in Mexico. It's very, very sad. So she comes to the United States. So she observes this family losing its way. And eventually there's a huge fight between the family. And Araceli's left alone with the two boys. The two boys are Brandon and Keenan. They're 11 and 8. And Brandon, the older boy, they're very sheltered kids. That's something I think I noticed about the States, is that it seemed like when I lived in Mexico, I'd come back, there seemed to be like a lot of loneliness here and a lot of sheltered people. So Araceli works with this family, they're very sheltered kids, and suddenly she's alone with them because the parents fought, and she has to take them to go find, she doesn't know where to take them. So she finds this old picture of a grandfather who used to live in South LA, like in the 50s. And she thinks that he must still live there because in Mexico people don't move, like they do here. It's kind of so she goes in search of their grandfather with these two boys, and she hates kids. She hates kids. So, because that's sort of the stereotype of the Latina housekeeper, which is really true, I'm sure, very often, is that, oh, they're so good with the kids, But I made her different. I made her so she hates she hates kids. So they're on the Amtrak and they're traveling from Orange County into the heart of Los Angeles over there. The train slowed to a walking pace, and a valley of smooth concrete walls suddenly opened alongside the tracks, stretching more than a mile in the distance, with several bridges vaulting over it. "What's that?" Keenan asked. "It's the river," Araceli said. Please, I'm exaggerating the voices. Please don't be offended by my Araceli. I'm just trying to get into her persona. "It's the river," Araceli said. "That's a river?" Brandon said, perplexed, until he noticed the bottom of the chasm held a narrow channel of flowing water with perfectly straight edges. "What's it called? What is it? Why is it made out of cement? It hasn't rained, so where does all the water come from?" "Too many questions," Araceli said. Too many? No one had ever told Brandon such a thing. "Yes." Brandon looked at the river and saw that a giant with a paint can had covered the top of the valley with a mosaic of sparkling, elephant-sized letters, spelling words in mongrel greens and tainted yellows that pulsated inside a pool of gray-blue swirls. Or at least it seemed like a giant had painted them. He wondered if he should ask Araceli, then decided against it. Nah, probably it was a giant. "Hey, look, there's people down there," Araceli, Keenan shouted, loud enough to get the attention of the 4 or 5 other adults in the train car, who looked up from their newspapers and laptops just long enough to glance at and quickly forget the familiar sight of the soiled caste who lived by this stretch of track. "Los homeless," Araceli said. And you see, there's no word in Mexican Spanish for homeless, so she has to say, "los homeless." Brandon pressed his nose against the glass and looked downward, spotting a line of shelters between the train tracks and the river, teetering house tents of oil-stained plywood, sun-bleached blue tarpaulin, frayed nylon rope, and aluminum foil. They looked like ground-hugging tree houses, improvised assemblages built by children and taken over by tubercular adults. A few humans sat on the chairs in between their creations in this village as it followed the curve in the tracks, their roofs a quilt of tarpaulin and wood, forming a long crescent dotted with the occasional column of smoke. Brandon searched for the sources of these fires, spotted a gangly man in aviator glasses tending to a kettle on a grill. The train slowly rolled toward the man, and for a few seconds, Brandon was directly above him. He bore a long scar on his cheek, oozing red and black liquids. A battle wound? Brandon wondered. A cut inflicted by a knife or a sword? A month earlier, Brandon had finished the last volume in a four-book series of novels, The Saga of the Fire Swallowers. I had to read a lot of young adult fiction to my kids. The Saga of the Fire Swallowers. And as he sat on the train with his nose pressed to the glass, the violent and disturbing denouement of that epic narrative seemed the only plausible explanation for the existence of this village of suffering passing below him. These people are refugees, Brandon thought. They are the defeated soldiers and the displaced citizens of the city of Vadur. The novels were a fantasy tale for young adult readers set in a world of pre-industrial stone villages. His father had bought the entire set and read them some years earlier, leaving them forgotten on a shelf for his oldest son to discover, Brandon's fascination growing with each chapter he spent in the company of its villains, a cult of rugged men and boys who engaged in the ritual eating of flames before and after battle. There was something about this homeless camp that seemed to belong to the ancient times described in those books, a way of life untroubled by electricity or modernity in general. In truth, Brandon should never have been allowed to read the Fire Swallower books, given their graphic descriptions of scorched earth warfare, including the slaughter of entire villages and their children with blades forged from various metals, real and fanciful, and the antagonists who filled their speeches with fascistic rationalizations about the weak, the strong, and the pure. It was all meant to be an allegory about the cruelty and demagoguery of the modern age, and its imagery drew heavily from the outrages of the 20th century. So much so, and so realistically, that the sharp-eyed 11-year-old Brandon had long ago concluded that the story was not entirely the product of a writer's imagination. Long before this train journey, Brandon had begun to warm to the idea that the Fire Swallower saga was, in fact, a thinly veiled, detailed account of a real but primitive corner of the actual world. Entire cities emptied of good people, civilians tortured, their homes and their books set to the torch. How could such injustice exist? How could humanity live with it? Brandon knew he should speak about what he read to his mother, who obviously had no idea about the taboos being broken in the works of literature he carried around the house. "You're such a good little reader," was all his mother said. It was stunning to be confronted with such adult naivete, though it was undeniably cool to possess knowledge forbidden to 11-year-olds who were not as precocious readers as he. Still, the stories in the saga caused him to lose sleep some nights, until he finally convinced himself that what he was reading was indeed fantasy. And now this, a wounded man, an actual victim of the Fire Swallower's wrath, driven to seek shelter by the concrete river with his fellow Vardurians. "Those flame-swallowing bastards!" Brandon cried out in imitation of the hero of the saga, the noble Prince Guhan. "¿Qué dices?" Araceli said. "Bastardos!" Suddenly, the 11-year-old was saying swear words. He's only been out of the house and into the world a few hours, and already he's been corrupted. "It's the Fire Swallowers," Brandon said in a tone of patient explanation, having realized quickly that Araceli had never read those books because they were in English after all. "The Fire Swallowers made these people refugees. They destroyed their towns and houses. They fled. They fled and they've come to live by the river. I read about it in Revenge of the River Walkers. The Fire Swallowers burned down their village, Vadur, because they wouldn't swear loyalty to the evil king. So they had to seek shelter in the riverbanks. But I never thought..." "Estás loco," Araceli said. "You read too much." No one had ever told Brandon such a thing. In the Torres Thompson home, reading was a sacred act. It was the one activity that children were allowed without time limits or parental supervision. Books were powerful and good. They told truths, and Brandon decided he should ignore his temporary caretaker's remarks and study the Vardurian camp and see what more secrets it might reveal. So, that's Brandon and Araceli. And the inspiration for that came from another work of art, Don Quixote, which, has anybody here read Don Quixote at all? It's a wonderful book. And, of course, we all know the famous story, it's this man who's read too many romance novels, and he goes out and thinks that the romance novels are actually taking place around him. And I read that book once again when I was about 40, and I realized that it was a work of realism. And that what Cervantes is saying in Don Quixote, he's saying, look, to the people back in 1600 when he wrote it, these romance novels about knights that you all are reading, they're just so silly. Look at this world around you. It's much more interesting and funny, actually. It's much more dramatic what's going on around you here in Spain. There were Moors who had been kicked out, and people who had been forced to convert from Judaism, and there were all kinds of prisoners back and forth. I mean, Don Quixote is really an amazing book, and I highly recommend the translation by Edith Grossman, which I read, and it's in this really modern English. So I read that novel, and I thought, I'll do that, because the reason I had written a previous novel that's about poverty in central LA, and it was kind of grim and sad, and I didn't want to do the same thing twice, right? You can't repeat yourself when you're an artist. And the other thing was that so many novels about Latino poverty and immigrants are I just didn't want to slip into the whole cliche. And so Brandon allows me to make a comment about how absurd things look when you have never seen them before, and so that's what Brandon does in this novel. And then he continues to have more adventures. They end up in South Central with a Salvadoran family, and it's next to this African-American man who's lived there forever, and they talk to him, and they have many more adventures as they enter inner Los Angeles. And eventually, they can't find, the grandfather there because he moved out, 40 years earlier. And so they eventually end up at Huntington Park. And Huntington Park, many of you might know, is sort of like the cultural capital of Mexican Southern California, more than East LA, really. Whenever the Mexican soccer team wins a game, they parade up and down Pacific Avenue, right, with Mexican flags. Maybe not so much anymore, but they used to a lot. And so I had the idea of having them arrive in Huntington Park the day, the 4th of July. That's why there's a fireworks in the middle of my novel. And so they arrive in Huntington Park, and there's a Mexican family having a 4th of July party, right? Which I like the irony in the comment on that. And also there's all these different kinds of people there, because we all know, just about everybody in LA knows a Latino person or Mexican person, and you know that there's all different kinds of people. And so here at this party, there's people who are recently arrived immigrants, and then there's other people who are really successful, even though they're immigrants, they came 20 years ago and they have a business. And then there's a girl who's going to Princeton, and she just came back from Princeton for the summer. And then there's her friend who got into an Ivy League school but couldn't go because she's undocumented, right? Because almost everybody in LA now knows somebody like that. It's sort of sad, right? So there's all these different kinds of people at this party, and it's sort of my commentary on the diversity of the Latino experience, and also on class in LA, because my kids now go to a private school, and that sort of sets up this particular passage. So Araceli is there at the 4th of July party. She's got her 2 kids. The kids are in a bouncy house jumping up and down with all the other kids. And Araceli is sort of getting the food when this begins. She's about to get her food. And there's all of these parents around who are Mexican working class people, but successful, kind of middle class. So Araceli was the deepest mystery to all the parents and older relatives present at this party, some of whom were a bit put off when she entered their circle. They were all standing by the tables and the pyramids of pork and side dishes. She was about to plunge her fork into a serving of carnitas when she noticed she had inadvertently brought the conversation between all the compadres around her to a sudden halt. "Buenas tardes," she said, eliciting a round of not especially friendly "Buenas tardes" in return. These mothers and fathers were put off too by Araceli's failure to pay much attention to the boys she was apparently assigned to look after, even when the older of the 2 approached and said with a stricken plea, "I think someone should tell all these kids to stop playing with firecrackers because it's so dangerous." "¿Qué quieres que haga?" Araceli asked rhetorically, because there was nothing she could do. And the boy snuck away, leaving all those who observed the exchange to wonder what exactly was going on here with this child-unfriendly woman and those American boys. "It's true what El Niño says," one of the moms said in Spanish. "Those things are too dangerous. Someone's going to get burned." They see more dangerous things at school, believe me," another mom said dismissively. And with this, all the mothers and fathers in the circle nodded. The other day, I go to pick up my son, and the entire school is surrounded by police cars and police officers, and there's what they call a lockdown. My son is in the 6th grade, believe it or not, and one of the kids is running down the hallway with a knife. I think he stabbed the teacher in the leg with it. ¡Qué barbaridad! The things that go on in those schools. My son is in the 6th grade too, and he doesn't know his times tables past 3, one of the fathers said. What's 6 times 8? I asked him, and he looks at me all confused. So I tell him, what are they teaching you there? And he says, I don't know. In my pueblo, they taught us that in the 2nd year. What are we supposed to do? One of the mothers said. You're supposed to go to the teacher and complain, Lucia Lujan, the one going to Princeton, interjected in English, having just entered the circle on the hunt for her own plate of food. You're supposed to get in the face of that teacher and say, what's up with the times tables? ¿Podemos hacer eso? Of course you can. That's how this country works. Go to a classroom full of white kids, and that's what their parents do all the time. They treat every teacher like a worker. Tiene razón, Araceli said. La señora Morín, mi jefa, siempre está peleando con los maestros. But if we go, they don't take us seriously, one of the mothers said, speaking directly to Lucia. You go to the office and they tell us, what are you doing here? Go away, we're busy. They all paused. Middle-aged and young, Mexican-born and U.S.-born, and considered the betrayal of the schools and the steel mesh that covered every window, the security cameras in the hallways, the posted warnings aimed at student and adult alike, and a few of them very self-consciously allowed their eyes to drift over to those young girls and boys who were their blood and their responsibility, running and bouncing in the backyard, each child gleaming and full of promise, and each poor and stripped of it. Boy and girl's screams filled the silence that followed, which was heavy with hurt and powerlessness and a certain unfocused sense of working man's defiance that found no words in which it could be expressed. Araceli broke the wordlessness suddenly to say that the kids that she was caring for seemed to be getting an excellent education. Where are they from? Los Laguna Rancho Estates, por la playa, en los cerros. I made this place up. Los Laguna Rancho Estates. The public schools are good down there, I bet, Lucia Lujan said. No van a la escuela pública, Araceli said. Private school, todo pagado, y muy caro, very expensive. I see the bills. How much? Lucia Lujan asked quickly. Araceli spoke the figure in slow and deliberate Spanish, allowing its mathematical obscenity, its thousands and thousands, to hover over the assembled hardworking, cash-strapped, tax-paying adults and scholarship-funded college students like a blinding glow of fake sunshine. There were 1 or 2 gasps, though Lucia Lujan's eyebrows rose with only moderate surprise. The tuition for those 2 boys put together was a bit more than her tuition at Princeton before all the financial aid kicked in. Imposible, one of the parents said. Estás loca, said another. No sea chismosa, por favor. It was preposterous, and suddenly everyone in the circle except Lucia was angry at Araceli for revealing a figure that, were they to accept it as truth, would temporarily strip them of some of their own moderately elevated sense of accomplishment by revealing just how small their achievements were relative to true American success and affluence. The compadres with kids in parochial school imagined they were paying top dollar, but in fact, it was a small fraction of the sum Araceli had just divulged, even though those gringo boys didn't look so much different than theirs, not especially special, and certainly not that rich. Es lo que cuesta, Araceli insisted. She explained that she knew this startling fact, not because she made any effort to find out, but rather because her employers were exceedingly casual with their paperwork and left letters and bills lying around. And with a dollar figure that big screaming from the kitchen countertop, even a normally circumspect housekeeper like Araceli had to take a look. You're pretty sure about that number, Lucia asked. Claro que sí, Araceli said. No, one of the compadres insisted. Estás confundida. I might be just a housekeeper and a chilanga, Araceli wanted to say, but I know basic English and math and the meaning of commas and decimal points and dollar signs. But instead, she gave a long glance at her disbelieving audience, then shook her head with a dismissive chuckle that was instantly recognizable to Lucia for its thick layering of intellectual condescension. So that's my novel, The Barbarian Nurseries. And what happens is that eventually the parents return and notice the boys are missing. And they go off searching there's a whole police network. That's the third part of my novel, is the sort of crazy media circus, which I know pretty well because I used to be inside of them as a reporter. And so there's this whole sort of trial that briefly takes place, and that's my novel. So, does anybody have any questions about my book? Yes? Questions or about writing? About yes.
Question. I'm curious how you decide or how you choose which phrases you write in the Spanish conversation and which in English.
Well, yeah, I know I read a lot of Spanish in there, but everything I think was partly understood by my reading of it, but also the context, And there's nothing that you really. I would say that I used to have I used to be much more controlled in my use of Spanish in my novel, in my writing. Partly because I still work at the newspaper. A little Freudian slip there. I used to work at the newspaper. In a newspaper, if you were to publish old Spanish untranslated, my BlackBerry would fill up with more hate mail than it used to always, then it would just fill up with a lot of hate mail from people who just don't really, so I wrote the first draft of my novel, and I decided that I would just have a lot of flavoring of Spanish, and every once in a while I would translate what it said, and then my editor read it. He's Sean McDonald, and he's from Laguna Beach, actually, and and he's also Juno Diaz's editor. Wow. And so Juno Diaz has 300 or 400 words in the footnotes that are totally in Spanish, untranslated. He told me, Hector, this whole thing of just translating, just don't do that, just let it go, and if they're speaking in Spanish in the novel and they're, have them speak in Spanish, and it's kind of a tricky thing. In that one passage I read, there are moments when they're all talking in Spanish and I'm translating, but mostly it's just what it would have sounded like if you were standing there. So, I had different instincts because, there is a whole tradition in American literature of allowing other languages into writing. If you read Lolita, for example, Nabokov has tons of untranslated French. And so there's a whole dispute about Spanish because to a lot of people, not so much people who read novels, but to a lot of people, it's a language of barbarism. It's a language of the other. It's a language that is part of what's contributing to California's decay is Spanish. And that's why my novel is called The Barbarian Nurseries, because it's about this image of the Mexican as this barbarous person. So I liked having that in there, and it was, it's part of my linguistic arsenal. I'm really proud of my English prose. It's the language that I was educated in, but I have this language that my grandmother and my parents spoke, and it's in my head, And other writers have, other lexicons in their head, but that's the one in mine, and it's part of the language of LA. So, I want people, I don't want to lose the reader, but I want to create a world for the reader to feel that they're in and have it be as authentic as possible, so that's sort of the dance. Yeah. Other question? Yes?
You said that you started the book in 2005, but being a librarian, I was obsessed with what year it really was, and I discovered partway through the book that it's the summer of 2008.
Yes.
So which is a very different time, and it was about the time of the recession and all of that. So at what point did you realize that your book was going to have this element of the looming financial crisis?
Well, I've been working on this book so long that I wrote the book 2 crises ago, the first version of the book, because you'll notice that there's a software company, right, in the book. And do you remember the first .com crash? Yes, bubble. That was when I first wrote it. And then I started working on it again I was working on it in 2005, 2006, 2007, and the whole economy started to crash again. Really, even worse than ever, than in a long time. And I had a couple of references there that made it even more specific what time it was. And I learned an important lesson about novels when I did that, because there was a line from Richard II. Woe to the country that's ruled by a child. And I'm really proud of that chapter because for a lot of reasons, but it also begins and ends with Shakespeare. And so, but there's this quote from Shakespeare in it from Richard II. And then someone in the story refers to, he likes saying that line because he thinks about our president, because the child is George W. Bush, who's ruling us. But my editor told me that I should probably cut that out because he wanted it to be more timeless. So novels take place. You try to scrub. Not always, but sometimes you try to scrub the time from it so it can feel. Because believe me, hopefully this crisis ends now pretty soon, but there'll be another one coming down the line in another 10 years or so. Yeah. Another question? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, when your novel is translated into Spanish, what happens with the Spanish-English?
Well, it hasn't been translated into Spanish, and it hasn't sold into Spanish. It's been translated into French and German, and into Italian next. And so it was a very those translators have decided to do what I did, which is to keep the original Spanish. Now, there is a problem, though, because there's some sort of puns in it. And so a couple of the reporters in Paris who interviewed me about this. Let's let that linger for a second. I left the way that sounds. Sorry. Some who interviewed me about this, one of them pointed out that there was this one scene which is based on the confusion of the word nightmare in English and Spanish. Because my mother, fluent English speaker, but kind of a really heavy accent, and she could never pronounce the word nightmare. So when I was a kid, she would say nightmare. And so I gave that to Araceli. And she's sleeping next to the boys because they're afraid because their mother and father haven't come home. And one of the boys starts yelling, "Mommy, mommy, 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 mommy," which kids do when they're scared in the middle of the night. And so she says, Brandon, wake up, you're having a nightmare, you're having a nightmare. And suddenly he stops being scared and he says, "What? I'm having a what?" And he says, "No, in English we say nightmare," correcting her. And she gets very upset. "Pues una pesadilla, entonces." So in French, it's cauchemar. Cauchemar? Yes? Cauchemar. So my French translator, wonderful man, he came up with caché mort. So caché mort means hidden dead. So he thinks that she's, and then he does a whole little riff on that. So yeah, it's that's. And so there's lots of layers of language in my book, and I don't know how many of you have read Huckleberry Finn, but there's this famous intro to Huckleberry Finn where Mark Twain says, those of you who are about to read this book will notice that there's all these different dialects in it, from the slave dialect of the lower, upper Missouri River to, the Louisiana, et cetera. And I tell you this because I don't want you to all think that all these characters are talking different, but trying to talk the same but sounding different. It's for a reason. And so I thought, well, every American novel could really do that. To tell you, every American novel about the diverse United States could do that. Junot Diaz could have done that with his last book. He could have, because he's got upper middle class Dominican Spanish. He's got working class Jersey Dominican influence, English. And he's got professorial Bostonian English. He's got, and so my novel is sort of the same. It has Mexico City Spanish. It has Central American Spanish. It has LA Spanish, which is kind of like this mixed up thing. And I had a lot of fun talking about this because there's, for example, the word piscar. In English in California, in Spanish in California, you say, me piscaron means they arrested me in slang, which means that it's like they picked you up. But piscar isn't understood in Spanish south of the Rio Grande because it's really a word from English. It's been made into pick, right? Me piscaron. So I did this whole sort of riff on this linguistic thing coming into Araceli's Spanish. So, anyways, so yeah, that's those are all these different layers of language. Yes. Another question? Yes.
Who are you reading right now?
Well, I get paid to read books now. I review books for the LA Times. And so...
Do you like
Sorry.
to read?
No, the reason I'm laughing is that I had an idea to do a piece about the presidential candidate's favorite books. One of his favorite books is Song of Solomon. The other candidate's favorite books is Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard. So you can sort of gather which is which. And I just have to say thank you to Mitt Romney. That was such a gift. Because Battlefield Earth is such a strange book. And I didn't read it. And I checked it out of the LA Public Library. I didn't go buy it. So, and I didn't read much past, and I admitted this, I didn't read much past the second chapter because it was exceedingly strange. And no, I came to this, and then he had some other books too that were actually really, he has Huckleberry Finn in his books, and also this great book about growing up in the Midwest called The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid by Bill Bryson, which is a really great memoir of Middle America. And then Middle America becoming more diverse because he grows up in Des Moines in the 50s. And at the beginning of the book, he only eats white bread. He never eats pasta, never had rice, never had any pizza, never had any foreign food. And by the end of the novel, he's got gay friends, and he goes to high school with actual, people of color, and it's all cool, It's a very interesting book. And so that's what I've been reading recently. I looked again at Song of Solomon. I met Toni Morrison. Well, I didn't meet her, but I saw her speak in Paris recently. It was like this amazing, kind of like seeing this. I was watching her speak, and after a while, I remember reading her when I was 21 or 19, and I'm a writer because of this lady. It was because I didn't really read literature because I didn't really know it could be cool or interesting until I started being 20. And Toni Morrison really opened my eyes to, and also Richard Wright and all these great writers. And I was staying in Paris, and I was around the street from where Richard Wright lived. Because like a lot of black writers of his generation, he sort of left the United States and went to go live in France, because in France, writers of all stripe are just the coolest thing. They're taking our picture everywhere we go. It's really cool. So, other questions?
This is a bit of a riff on the question that Elisa just asked. This book, for me particularly, it was a little painful. I grew up in Orange County, and went to schools in Irvine, and I live in Los Angeles now. And where I live now is still a little bit of a mystery to my family and friends who live in Laguna Niguel and Rancho Santa Margarita and all of these places. And so I love the journey through Southern California in this book, and I know that critically that's really one of the things that has been noted. What other books of Los Angeles or Southern California are you?
Well,
do you recommend?
There's my friend Jervy Turbalon, who wrote Understand This. It's set in South LA. And Susan Strait, who writes about the Inland Empire in this place that she invents called Rio Seco. And she, grew up in racially mixed sort of area, and so she writes about these sort of cultures mixing together. I love Chandler because he writes about where I grew up, but because I grew up in East Hollywood, and I could see it, in his novels. I just read a pretty good novel by T.C. Boyle about, but I didn't give it the greatest review because it was sort of like, it was good, but I expected more from him, and it was set in the Channel Islands, so there's just tons and tons and tons of stuff, But I sort of like, my answer to that question too is, I sort of wrote the LA novel that I wanted to read, which is what Toni Morrison once said. So, the question is?
Yeah, it's kind of going off that question. One of my favorite scenes is the 5 freeway scene. So I was just wondering how you kept this vast expanse of kind of culture and also geography separate as you were writing these 3 stories, and how do you delineate? And also when you go to places that have never heard of South Whittier, like how do you, like what's the reaction to that, I guess?
Reaction in what sense?
In terms of, like, oh, what's up? I never heard of Whittier before. Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's, I think that my novel, I was always, I think in general, a novel is a huge project. And so I'm always sort of thinking about the space where I'm in, right? And so, when I think of those sections I wrote in South Whittier, well, I grew up in South Whittier. And so I actually went out there and I drew a lot from, because that's sort of the way I work now. I have to go see things. Yeah, I think that I knew that I had to be really sort of specific, and that I sort of had to always have a sense of wonder. I hate South Whittier. I mean, I grew up there, went to high school. I'm sorry if anybody here is from South Whittier. But I'm really, has issues, has to do with my mother in high school, what happened to me the first day that I was a freshman, you know, all this stuff. But I hate South Whittier. So I went down, but I had to make it sort of, you know, real and come alive. And so, I know that's how, I don't really hate it, I'm just kidding. I'm being dramatic. But you know, I have issues with the place. And so I think, you know, I think that I wanted to make really sort of, when you're an Angelino, and you're forced to leave where you grow up, or what you know, because there's so many worlds here, and see another world, to me there's a sense of wonder that I have. And so I wanted to communicate that sense of wonder, you know, not have it feel like, you know, for me South Whittier has all these associations to it, but I liked it as this sort of, you know, lower middle class kind of place, and I put a river through it, and I put the parrots, these crazy wild parrots in it, because I obsess about wild parrots. And so, yeah, I think, and there has been a lot of really interesting response, you know. Now that I was abroad, I can see, and also there's a lot of people who are not from LA who have read it, but when I was abroad, you know, I was in Germany, in Munich, and the whole sort of class division, you know, they have ethnic divisions that are kind of class divisions. There's a lot of Turks and a lot of, you know, people from the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union doing service jobs, right? But I talked to them in my reading about things that have happened to me in LA that, you know, to me, us are really familiar. Like, for example, when I was younger, I was confused once for a valet in front of a restaurant. You know, somebody gave me their keys. Another time, I was picking the weeds from the yard in my own house. There was a for sale sign. I was really proud of my new house, you know, first house ever, and I'm picking the weeds, and some very nice lady walked by and she said, "Do you know how much they paid for it?" And I said, "I can tell you how much I paid for it. It's my house," you know, and so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it happened to me 2 years ago at a youth soccer game. A little boy of 11, or no, younger, 8, comes up to me, and I'm watching the game, you know, and he comes up to me, he pulls $1. He says, "Can I have an ice cream?" And I looked around, there's several of us parents, but I'm the only Latino parent, and there's an ice cream cart that's like about 10 yards away, you know? And the man who was selling the ice cream had stepped back a little bit. And I said, "You see that man over there with a baseball hat? He's selling the ice creams." And so I told the story in Germany. And people were like, later, my editor came up to me and he said, "Wow, that was really a weird story. It's weird that happens to you." Because in Germany, that would never happen. You know, I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, well, you know, one thing, Germans are kind of really polite, and you wouldn't sort of assume, and also, especially Bavaria, I guess, has this really strong middle class, and they just don't have, you know, those kinds of scenes. They don't happen. It's Munich, right? So a lot of bad other things happen there." It's like, that place right there, that's a very notorious place. This is where Hitler spoke. And this place over here, it's named for the Scholls, because Sophie Scholls and her brother, you know, they stood up to the Nazis. You know, had their heads cut off. That's what this place is named for. You know, and so yeah, they know what, like, you know, racism is and injustice, but they don't know the particular kind of California brand of it. And that's another reason why I wrote. And, you know, I think, you know, was because we have this whole vision of California that exists in the rest of the world, right? And, you know, it has, I mean, mostly it's, you know, like my agent told me once, my first novel, I said, "Hey, Jay, Tattooed Soldier made the LA Times bestseller list." And he said, "Yeah, we saw that. We were joking about what else might be on the LA Times bestseller list. Was there, like, you know, something about plastic surgery there?" And, you know, it was like, "Oh my gosh, my agent," you know? So there's this whole vision, you know, and even he's from Beverly Hills. But his, you know, there are people who you know, say that when they think of LA, they think of silicone implants, you know, and they think of palm trees and stuff. And so that is why I wrote my book. I mean, that's why I'm a writer, you know, is because, no, you know, that's not it's not just, that movie vision of LA. I mean, this is like, we have this really important world city that it's old, and it's old too. For me, when I was writing my column, I loved writing about 19th century LA, because we have a 19th century city here among us, even here, there was ranchos here, and there are still a couple of structures standing. So that, so I think that to be really, really sort of specific and to embrace everything with fresh eyes. And so the one passage I had the most fun doing was when Brandon and Keenan are in South LA in 35th Street, and they're looking, and this boy who's there tells them, all the stuff that happens there, and it's like this sort of place of wonder. And that was based on Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. And because he has this thing, the story in Invisible Cities, Marco Polo is telling the Emperor Kublai Khan all the wonders of the empire because he's never seen them. And so that was sort of the sense of just like, you always have to, keep this sense of newness about. And LA is good that way because you can always discover a new part of the city. Lately, it's like everybody's riding bicycles. It's like, wow, I never saw that before. There's like, I saw 50 people on a bicycle going down Figueroa, at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday. Wow, I never saw that. That's a new, if you've lived in LA your whole life, The fact that I was like driving down Olympic, I got off the freeway, and there's like this, the bicyclists were passing me on Olympic, That's, and so I think you have to embrace the sense of wonder about it. Another question?
Yeah, sorry, I already asked you one, but you mentioned that when you wrote the first draft, it was very bad, you realized later because you were so angry. In the draft that got published, the version that got published, do you feel like you were able to convey what you were angry about?
Yes.
Or just in a less...
Yes. I think I earned that. That's why I read this one passage about class, there was a couple of passages where I thought, now I've earned this moment, where there is this outrage about these divisions. And that dialogue, where the parents are saying about there was a lockdown in my school and they stabbed the kid in the leg and, all this, that stuff is actual from a column that I wrote where I went out to a school that had been taken over. And that's what the parents were saying. My kid doesn't know his times tables. And I couldn't make that up. It was something given to me by the city, gave it to me. So I felt like this whole novel now becomes this, it's this celebration of reading, really. For me, hidden in this is my celebration of reading. It's all the books that I've read. But it's also this rage that I feel towards LA. I mean, and there I sort of made it funny and I gave Araceli these things to say, but I wrote that passage. It was one of the last things I wrote because my editor asked me to add more in the middle of the book, and so I wrote this section in the middle. And then the other moment where I thought, oh, this is my whole human justification for writing this book, and now that I wrote this sentence, I know that I'm going to finish, was when Araceli she's being interrogated by the district attorney, and she laughs at them, and I thought, yes, she laughed. And then I have this whole sort of like, intellectualized thing that I did, which is that I describe her laughter. And it's a carcajada in Spanish, which is like a cackle. And I say it's an onomatopoeia. And I sort of liked that I could sort of, that it wasn't just Araceli laughing at the situation. I was laughing at it as a writer, as someone who got mistaken for the valet and the gardener. Here I am laughing at this. I've since found out that in all languages of the world, the words for laughter are usually onomatopoeias. Laugh is an onomatopoeia. It comes from the sound. So anyways, cackle, guffaw. There's so many great words for laughter. So, but I really, and even with that, there's a lot of people who, a few critics and some people who just don't like being taken there. There was a critic for, I think, Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg. Maybe it was the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg. He said, this is this character is like unlike any other, but why? I don't understand why Mr. Tobar. I really don't really need to know, Mr. Tobar, about that the justice system is unfair to undocumented immigrants. Do I really need to know that? And I felt like saying, yeah, you do need to know that. Because, and you not only do you need to know that, you need to know that the writer who's telling you that also read Twain and also knows about W.B. Du Bois and also knows about this whole history of inequality that we're sort of living in. That's what I want you to know, that this is part of the American story. That's why the first epigraph is the American mystery deepens, because Araceli is Mexican, but she's like this American story. And so all of those ideas, I feel like I really earned them, and it took a lot of sweat to make them a work of art.
I don't want to give away too much because I love the book, and everyone I know hasn't, and so I don't like spoiler alerts exactly. But could you say a little bit about why you took Araceli where you did? I mean, I think as a reader, you're thinking this could go horribly wrong. Like there's like the really bad thing that can happen to Araceli, and then there's like a range of good things that can happen.
A lot of people expect that the kids are going to get killed.
Yeah, I mean, how did you decide? I mean, did you decide from the very beginning, kind of the arc and where you were going with it, and that you wanted what you kind of wanted to happen?
Well, I didn't want it to be about her being a victim, even though she's victimized in the novel. Because we all know what it's like. It's like all of us have been victimized in one way or another, in a little way, and that's not really who we are. That moment when we feel powerless, that moment when we feel like someone's not taking us seriously, someone has, for our age or for what we look like or our gender, whatever, that's not who we are. You know what I'm saying? So that's not who Araceli is. And so I wanted to give her this sense of power at the end. And the ending of the novel is, the journey that she takes was in the first version of the novel. Because there is this it's the grapes of wrath in reverse, because she's leaving California, and I even mocked that more in the first draft, and I sort of I toned it down a little bit, and so I didn't want, I wanted it, that was where I was headed. I was headed towards, it's very complicated to sort of make it all sort of believable and have it all sort of come off at the end. And I talked to lawyers about the criminal stuff, which was fun. It's always fun to do research, So So, yes.
I'm curious about. I mean, it sounds like you like each book is a real labor of love.
Yes.
And, I'm curious about how you recover from between finishing one book and starting and finishing another one.
I guess what I've always done is I've always had the books sort of overlapping each other. I've always been working at 2 or 3 at the same time. So when I was finishing this, I was writing a proposal for my next book, a nonfiction book. But then I got a job assignment to do the book that I'm currently working on, which is about the Chilean miners, the guys who were buried alive. So I'm writing their sort of official book. I've been granted exclusive access to them, So while I've been working on that book, I worked on that book while my other novel was finishing up the revisions to my novel, and it's sort of, they're always overlapping. But I remember crying. I mean, a couple of times when I thought, this is the last time I'll ever write something for Araceli. This is the last time. Goodbye, Araceli. Been living with you for a long time now, and that that's kind of an emotional thing when you've been living with somebody, an imaginary person in your head for 5 or 6 years. And but I think there's always, I think now more than ever in my life too, I've come to accept the fact that I'm an artist. This is kind of something that's really taken me a long time. I'm almost going to be 50 pretty soon. And when I went to Paris and everyone started telling me I was an artist, I figured I must be, because they're French. They're like, yeah. And I love the word for novelist in French. It's romancier. And so, I think that it's really, I'm thinking about the next, I wrote a proposal for a fellowship grant for the next novel I want to write, and I've been living with that book for a long time. I've been researching it, and I've known, it's about a real person, and I've known this real person's family now for 4 years now. He died in the 1980s, but, and so I've known, I've been living with that a long time, and so I think it just becomes, like I say, it just becomes part of your lifestyle, and also books move so slowly that you have lots of chances to say goodbye to it, because there's the moment you send it to your agent. Then there's the moment that you get it back from your editor with the notes. And then there's the moment when you send it off to him, revise. And then there's the moment when you get back the pages, the page proofs, and you get to go through it. And then that happens 3 times. For Farrar, and Giroux, they're real old-fashioned. 3 times you get the pages back. And each time they say, change less, than the time before. This time, don't really change anything, And so then you finally say goodbye to it. And then the very last thing that I changed in this book was thanks to one of my best friends, Jesse Katz, who's kind of a smart aleck, because he read the hardcover version, and he wrote me a note with each typo he found. And my editor said, Hector, there's always 2 or 3 in every book I've ever published, so don't worry about it. So he found like 4 typos, and so I sent those into the paperback editor, and that was the last thing that I changed in it. So, so it's a whole lifestyle thing. So yeah, you never really, and now with this novel, I I last worked on it in 2010, and now 2 years later, I'm still talking about it, at different places, and I still really like the characters. I haven't got bored from it or anything. So yes.
Going back to the Spanish version,
yes.
Is it going to be published in Spanish? And
no, it hasn't been sold in Spanish. No.
And why is it so hard for?
I've never had any novel of mine or any book of mine translated into Spanish.
And I wonder why that is. It's very unusual.
I don't know.
When
it's
there's
very
a
usual.
large market,
there are actually novelists, writers from South America who I met recently in Paris, who have had books that they wrote in Spanish that have never been published in Spanish, but they published in French, because the French are kind of crazy about books. And so, I don't know. That's a whole marketing question. It's Madrid, and I don't know the euro, and I don't know what's going on. And I don't even know how many copies of my books I sold, because I don't really care. I don't really, pay attention to that.
And did anybody thought you were Paulo Coelho? You look a lot like
No, I've been confused for Billy Joel, and never for Paulo Coelho. No, never. One last one? Should I take? So do we have? I think I have time for one last question. Yes, over there.
Just hearing the way that you speak about the city, you make it really sound like a character, like it's the second protagonist to Araceli. Did you ever feel like while you were writing the book, as if like the city was its own character, like you really personified it?
No, definitely. I think that, I'm a native Angelino, born and raised, East Hollywood, then Montebello and South Whittier. I lived in Orange County when I started the first draft of the book because I lived in Fullerton. I liked Fullerton a lot, and also I was studying at UC Irvine, so I would drive to these places that are like this, that have those fake names you see on the freeway, Camino Balata, It's like, we didn't see anything, Messing with me, San Clemente, stop it, And so, I think that's. I think that I can sort of see my writing career. There are certain skills that I have that I've accumulated over time, and I didn't have them when I first started out. So I remember when the first skill that I had, I was a good expository writer. I could write good term papers, Then I could write good letters to the editor, and then I could write good little political analysis pieces. And then I became a reporter, and I started to write about neighborhoods, and I could write physical descriptions really well. That's like the beginning of, everyone has there's no formula, right? Anyone who writes, you can approach it in any different way, but that's my own particular sort of way of coming. And so then I got physical descriptions. That was like something I could do really well. The first thing I could do really well that a novelist needs to do. And then I was a little bit harder with physical descriptions of people. And I remember when I was in my 20s and 30s, obsessing about how could I describe people. I bought lots of visual dictionaries. I'd ask lots of questions. When I was writing this book, I asked lots of questions about clothes to women and to, I had 2 women protagonists. I'd ask lots of questions about how women act, and I, just took a few little insights. And also just getting older, I know this is aside from your question, but I remember once, I was washing the dishes, and I get lots of ideas for my novel, washing the dishes, and I'm washing the dishes, and my wife tells me to put away the plastic dishes on the bottom and the nicer dishes on top. That's the system that she has. And I looked at her and I realized honey, I know why you do that. Why the plastic dishes go on the bottom and the porcelain dishes on top? Because it's the plastic dishes that the kids, can get them there, and the porcelain dishes. It's like, wow, that's the whole system, right? And she says, how many years have we been married? How old are our kids? And it's taken me all this time to sort of have this insight as to why, And I was like, oh my God, And then at that same moment, I was thinking, one weekend my wife was away, and it's like, okay, I got the kids for myself. This, our Araceli Modesta or whatever, was gone, and so it was just me and the kid, the two boys. We didn't have our daughter yet, and it's like, or our daughter was a little baby, and so I do all this stuff. I gotta change diapers. I gotta, make chicken fingers, in the grill. Do the dishes. Make sure everything's clean. Make sure the kids aren't, watching too much television. Make sure they're not gonna, write on the walls. And it's like, wow, back and forth. And it's like a couple of hours of this. And I'm thinking, man, I really got this under control. I'm a badass right now, parent. And then I'm thinking, no one ever gives you a prize for this. This is like, you're never getting recognition. They don't give you a plaque that says, on August 27th, Héctor Tobar successfully managed, to a level of outstanding, of excellence, his family domestic life, and that's, of course, I because that's the way my mind operates. I get prizes, I get medals, I get like A's, front page story. And so I thought, oh my God, that's what it is to be, a woman in a house when you are, when you are a working mother, when you're, that's no one, you have to do all this stuff with your kids, raise them well, and it's its own reward. And so I, scribbled that down someplace, and I gave that to Maureen to say, at some point in my novel. So anyways, I think, so those are things that I learned later in life. So I think the whole city thing, I was all pretty much in tune with that. And then later, how family works, childhood, all these different sort of things. I remember I had these gardens in the novel, and so I had to, learn how to describe this stuff because I didn't know anything about gardening. So I go to the Huntington Gardens, and they have a desert garden, they have a subtropical garden. And so I would study the plants and, and live with them for a little bit. And, and so that was all those different sort of skills. A novelist has all these different sort of skills, this analytical part. And so I've been sort of gradually assembling them, throughout my life. But the whole thing about the city, that goes really deep in my roots because I grew up in East Hollywood, and I have that in my memory. And so, well, thank you all for coming. We'll be signing books. Thank you for the questions.